Beef vindaloo. Super tender beef that's slowly braised in a spicy and tangy Indo-Portuguese style gravy. It's not the first thing you think about when cooking on the grill, but it should be. This is usually a stovetop recipe, but when cooked over a fire, it gets a rich wood smoke flavor that definitely takes it up a notch. The trick to this cook is temperature control. You want to get that temperature spot on so it slowly simmers for the right amount of time to absorb the smoke and tenderize the beef. Too low and it'll take forever to cook. Too hot and all of the flavor compounds will break down and it'll just taste flat. This is traditionally had with some white rice or naan, but it totally works with some pasta or on top of some polenta or grits. You do you. I started with the beef. For this recipe, I used a 2.5 pound piece of beef chuck. Most recipes go with pork, but this will work with any other meat just as long as it has enough fat. I started by cutting the beef up into fairly large cubes. It'll need to simmer in the gravy for a while, so if I cut it up into pieces that are too small, it'll just all fall apart and overcook. Once the meat was cut, I put it into a bowl with some salt and oil, and I just let it sit for a bit while I prepped everything else. This should give it enough time for the salt to start to penetrate the meat. Okay, next up the onions. This is definitely an onion heavy recipe. I used 3 large onions for this. Once they were all cooked down, the sweetness of the onions went really well with the spicy and vinegar heavy gravy. If you've seen some of my previous videos, I really like to use a mandolin to cut my onions. The mandolin that I have has blades for slicing into cubes and strips, so it made it super simple to prep a lot of onions quickly. Okay, now for my favorite part, setting up the grill. I tend to use lump charcoal when I grill because it gets super hot, but I hate how much of it falls through the grates on my grill. So I got this mini grate. It's got a finer mesh so less charcoal should fall through, and I'm also going to use my vortex again for this cook. While the charcoal's heated up, I got started with the Vindaloo marinade. For the recipes, I used 1 teaspoon of mustard seeds, 2 teaspoons of cumin seeds, 16 dried cloves, 20 black peppercorns, and most importantly, 20 dried Kashmiri chilies. Kashmiri chili are a type of chili that descended from a type of chili brought to India from the Americas and ended up growing in the northern part of India and evolved into what we now know as Kashmiri chilies. The chilies are moderately hot, but they also have a ton of flavor and add a nice bright red color to food. I got a pack of these at my local Asian grocery store, but if you can't find the dried chilies, use about 30 grams of Kashmiri chili powder. I started by toasting the spices to get them to release more flavor. Once the spices were toasted, I ground them up with 20 cloves of garlic, a 2-inch piece of ginger, 1 teaspoon of sugar, and 1 cup of apple cider vinegar. The authentic recipes actually use toddy vinegar, which is a vinegar made from fermenting the sap of coconut trees. It's pretty hard to find, so either apple cider or red wine vinegar will also work. Okay, blend this up until it becomes a thick paste and mix it together with the beef. Let the two marinate for a bit while we get started cooking the gravy. For the gravy, I cooked down the onions until they started to caramelize and get a deep brown color. This should take about 10 minutes. Once the onions are browned, in went the beef cubes into the pan, and I sauteed them for 5 minutes. Okay, now there should still be some marinade left in the bowl, and this stuff is pure flavor, so use some water to dissolve any remaining marinade and add it to the pan. And go ahead and top the pan off with water until the beef is fully covered. Okay, now it's time to smoke it. What I did was keep the temperature inside the grill to about 250 degrees for about 3 hours. This was enough time for the beef to tenderize and the gravy to thicken and absorb all that smoke. Since I've got the vortex already set up underneath, I'm just going to lift the pan up a bit to get it a few inches away from the grate. This way it can simmer and not boil when I put the lid back on. If you're going to do this, you can also use an indirect setup with something like a slow and sear or just banked charcoal. You can also use a heat deflector and put it underneath the pan. For the smoke flavor, I ended up using some applewood chunks. I let this cook and I checked on it about every hour or so. If the water was starting to dry up, I topped it up, but I only did this for the first 2 hours. After 2 hours, the beef should start to tenderize and there should still be a decent amount of liquid left in the pan. At this point, you can take it off and you'll end up with what most consider authentic Vindaloo, But since it's a barbecue recipe, I'm gonna keep going. I want the beef to be pull apart tender, and I want the sauce to absorb a ton of smoke and get a rich and thick consistency. This way, you can still have it like a gravy with some rice, but it's also thick enough to have like a saucy pulled meat sandwich. Once the gravy had the right consistency, which for me took about 3 hours, I took it off. Okay, because this was cooking for a while, some of the flavors may have started to mellow out, so most recipes recommend adding back some of the tangy elements before serving. For this, I added 3 tablespoons of red wine vinegar. You can also add salt and sugar if you think it's needed. Now, this was done, and I topped it off with some onions and cilantro for the thumbnail. Now, look at that, spicy, smoky, sweet, sour. This thing has all the flavors. Now, put some rice on a plate. You can put the beef and sauce on the top or to the side. You do you. And because I'm one of those people who don't perceive cilantro as soap, I just added a few leaves of cilantro on top for some color and a squeeze of lemon. Give this a taste. And honestly, this does not taste like a homemade version of beef vindaloo. I think this tastes even better than the vindaloo you get at most restaurants. And best of all, you can make it at home on your grill, so try it out.